Before the world heard the name Fidel Castro, before Cuba became famous for its revolution, the island was known for something very different: its beauty. Cuba, the largest island in the Caribbean, was often called the Pearl of the Antilles. It was a land of sunshine, sugar, music, and the smell of tobacco leaves drying in wooden barns. From above, the island looked like a green jewel floating in a sea of blue. But beneath this beauty, life in Cuba was far from fair. In the early 1950s, Cuba was a country of sharp contrasts. If you walked through the streets of Havana, you would see elegant buildings, fancy hotels, shiny American cars, and busy nightclubs filled with laughter and music. Tourists from the United States came to enjoy beaches, casinos, and tropical drinks. For them, Cuba felt like a playground in the sun. But if you traveled only a few miles outside the city, into the countryside, you would find a very different world. There, poor farmers lived in wooden shacks with dirt floors. Many worked long hours cutting sugarcane under the hot sun, earning very little money. They had no electricity, no clean water, and often no schools for their children. While the rich lived in comfort, the poor struggled to survive. This deep divide between the wealthy few and the poor majority was one of the biggest problems in Cuba. Cuba's economy depended mostly on sugar. The country's rich soil and warm climate made it perfect for growing sugarcane. Huge plantations stretched for miles, owned by a small group of wealthy Cubans and by American companies. In fact, by the 1950s, U.S. businesses controlled much of Cuba's sugar industry, as well as many of its banks, railroads, and telephone lines. This meant that even though Cuba was an independent nation, much of its money and power were in foreign hands. Many Cubans began to feel that their island was not truly their own. They worked hard, but much of the profit left the country. At the same time, the U.S. government had a strong influence over Cuba. Cuban leaders often depended on American support to stay in power. To many Cubans, this relationship felt unfair, like living in the shadow of a much bigger neighbor. In this world of inequality and outside influence, one man rose to power: Fulgencio Batista. Batista was a military leader who had already ruled Cuba once before in the 1940s. Back then, he presented himself as a reformer who cared about the poor. He built schools and promised jobs, and for a while, many Cubans liked him. But by the early 1950s, things had changed. In 1952, Batista led a military coup, meaning he took control of the government by force. He canceled elections that were about to take place and declared himself the ruler of Cuba once again. This time, Batista's rule was very different. He ruled like a dictator. Under Batista, Cuba's government became corrupt. That means people in power often used their positions to get rich instead of helping others. Bribes, favoritism, and crime spread through the country. The police and army supported Batista, but many citizens began to lose trust in their leaders. In Havana, the capital city, the nightlife sparkled. Casinos, cabarets, and hotels flourished, many of them owned or supported by American businesspeople and organized crime groups. Tourists continued to come, spending money on gambling, rum, and music. The city became famous for its energy, but also for its moral decay. Meanwhile, outside Havana, ordinary Cubans felt forgotten. Many farmers worked for large landowners and had no land of their own. Teachers were few, doctors were scarce, and hunger was common. Children often had to quit school to help their families earn money. This unfairness grew heavier every year, like a storm gathering strength over the island. By the mid-1950s, many Cubans were tired of promises. They had seen leaders come and go, but their lives stayed the same. They wanted change, real change. But how could ordinary people fight a powerful army or a corrupt system? Some tried to protest peacefully. Others formed small political groups that demanded democracy, fair elections, honest government, and freedom of speech. But Batista's secret police arrested, tortured, or even killed those who spoke out. Fear spread, and many citizens stayed silent, afraid of what might happen if they resisted. Still, not everyone was afraid. Some young people began to dream of revolution, of fighting for justice, even if it cost them everything. One of those young men was Fidel Castro. Fidel was born in 1926, the son of a farmer. He grew up in the countryside, surrounded by sugar fields and workers who struggled to make a living. From a young age, he noticed the difference between the rich and the poor. He studied hard, attended good schools, and became a lawyer. But even as a student, he was outspoken, always talking about injustice, corruption, and the need for reform. When Batista seized power in 1952, Fidel was furious. He had planned to run for political office in those elections, hoping to make changes through the law. But Batista's coup destroyed that dream. Fidel realized that peaceful politics might not work in a country ruled by a dictator. So he decided to fight, not with words, but with action. Castro began to gather a small group of idealistic young people, students, workers, and farmers who shared his anger and his hope. They met in secret, whispering about freedom, dignity, and justice. They believed that Cuba deserved more than corruption and inequality. They believed it was time for a revolution. But they were not the first to dream of it. Throughout Cuban history, brave men and women had fought for independence, first from Spain in the 1800s, and now, some felt, from their own government's corruption. Revolution, in many ways, was in Cuba's blood. By 1953, the group had a plan, a daring and dangerous one. Before the revolution began, Batista tightened his grip on the island. Newspapers that criticized him were shut down. Union leaders who organized workers were imprisoned or killed. Anyone suspected of opposing the government could disappear overnight. But even in fear, the people whispered about change. In the marketplaces, in schools, in sugar fields, and in cafes, they spoke quietly about injustice. They told stories about brave Cubans of the past who had fought for freedom and wondered if someone might rise again to lead them. And in the city of Havana, that someone was already preparing. While all this was happening, the United States watched closely. For America, Cuba was an important neighbor, just 90 miles south of Florida. The U.S. government saw Batista as a friend because he allowed American businesses to operate freely and help protect their interests. Many American officials didn't see the suffering of the Cuban people. They saw profits, stability, and beaches filled with tourists. They didn't realize how much anger was growing under the surface, anger that would soon explode into a revolution that would change everything. Even in hard times, the Cuban spirit remained alive. Music filled the streets. The rhythms of salsa, mambo, and rumba carried through the night. People danced, laughed, and celebrated whenever they could. But behind every song and every smile, there was also frustration. The young especially felt restless. They looked at their beautiful island and wondered why it belonged to so few. Some joined universities and tried to bring change through education and activism. Others believed that only a bold act could shake the system, an act that would wake up the whole country. Among those dreamers stood Fidel Castro, preparing quietly for what he believed was his destiny. By 1953, Batista's rule seemed strong. The army obeyed him, the police silenced anyone who disagreed, foreign investors were happy, and Havana continued to glitter with lights and music. But every dictatorship, no matter how strong, has cracks, and through those cracks, hope began to shine. In the hills, in the classrooms, in the hearts of young men and women, a fire was building. It was still small, still hidden, but it was spreading. Soon, that fire would burst into the open and sweep across the island. It would be called La Revolución, the Revolution. The Cuba of the early 1950s was a land of contradictions, rich and poor, light and shadow, laughter and fear. While tourists saw a paradise, many Cubans saw pain. They wanted land, fairness, and dignity. And in their search for those things, they would follow a man who promised them freedom, a man named Fidel Castro. But revolutions never begin overnight. They begin with a feeling, a spark of injustice that refuses to die. And that spark in 1953 was about to ignite. By the early 1950s, Cuba looked peaceful on the surface. The beaches were full of tourists, the city lights glittered, and the music never stopped. But inside the hearts of many Cubans, a quiet anger was growing. People were tired of watching a few grow rich while so many went hungry. They were tired of watching their leaders steal from them and call it progress. And in 1953, that anger finally found a voice. A young man named Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was only 26 years old, but he already had big dreams for his country. He was tall, confident, and spoke with passion that made people listen. When he talked about injustice, his eyes burned with determination. He believed that every Cuban, rich or poor, deserved dignity, education, and freedom. As a lawyer, Fidel had seen how unfair the system was. He'd tried to fight for justice in the courtroom, but under Batista's dictatorship, the courts were not truly free. The powerful always won, and the poor always lost. That's when Fidel made a life-changing decision. If the law could not bring justice, then justice would have to be fought for. He began to gather friends and followers, young men and women who believed in his dream of a free Cuba. They came from universities, farms, and small towns. Some were students, some were workers. All of them were ready to risk their lives for change. Castro's first big plan was daring and dangerous. He decided to strike at the heart of Batista's military power, the Moncada Barracks in Santiago de Cuba. This was one of the largest army bases on the island. If they could take it over, even for a short time, they could inspire the people to rise up. It was meant to be the spark that would set off the fire of revolution. The plan was risky, very risky. Castro and his small group of rebels had little training and few weapons. They didn't have tanks, airplanes, or foreign support. What they did have was courage, belief, and the element of surprise. To the young revolutionaries, it didn't matter that they were outnumbered. They believed they were fighting for something greater than themselves, the soul of their nation. It was early morning on July 26, 1953. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city of Santiago de Cuba. Fidel and about 160 young rebels dressed in stolen army uniforms quietly surrounded the Moncada Barracks. Their hearts were pounding. For many of them, this was their first time holding a gun, but they believed this day would mark the beginning of Cuba's freedom. The plan was simple: surprise the guards, take control of the barracks, seize weapons, and call the people to revolt. But things didn't go as planned. A car got lost on the way, the guards noticed something was wrong, and within minutes, chaos broke out. Gunfire echoed through the streets. The rebels fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. The army had more soldiers, better weapons, and full control of the area. Dozens of rebels were killed in the attack. Many others were captured. The Moncada attack had failed. For Batista's government, the failed attack was proof of rebellion, and they responded with terrible cruelty. Captured rebels were beaten, tortured, and executed without trial. Blood ran through the barracks. It was a dark moment for Cuba. Fidel and his brother Raúl Castro were captured a few days later. Many people thought they would be killed too, but instead they were brought to court. In that courtroom, something unexpected happened. Instead of being silent, Fidel decided to speak for himself. He stood tall, even though he was facing life in prison, and gave a speech that would change his life and Cuba's future forever. In his defense speech, Fidel spoke calmly but powerfully. He said that he was not a criminal, but a patriot. He explained why he had led the attack, not for fame or power, but because his country was suffering. He listed the 5 main goals of his movement: land for the poor farmers who worked it, honest government without corruption, fair share of profits for workers, education for every child, freedom for all Cubans. Then he ended with words that would echo through history: "Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me." Those words became a symbol of hope. Even though the Moncada attack had failed, Castro's speech turned him into a hero for many Cubans who were quietly wishing for change. After the trial, Fidel and his companions were sent to prison on the Isle of Pines, a small island south of Cuba. There they spent nearly 2 years behind bars. Life in prison was harsh, but it did not break their spirit. Instead, it made them stronger. Fidel used his time to study, write, and plan. He spoke with his fellow prisoners about their future, not just how to escape, but how to rebuild Cuba when the time came. They dreamed of a country where every Cuban had food, education, and a voice. Outside the prison, people began to talk about them. The failed attack turned into a legend. Many Cubans who had never heard of Fidel Castro before now saw him as a brave young man who dared to stand up to Batista. While Castro was in prison, Batista's government continued its rule with fear and violence. The poor grew poorer. Corruption grew deeper. The gap between rich and poor became a wound that no one could ignore. Whispers began to spread across the island. "Have you heard of Fidel Castro?" people asked each other quietly. "They say he stood up to Batista. They say he's still alive." Hope, small but persistent, started to grow again in the hearts of the people. Even some members of the church, students, and intellectuals began to question the government's cruelty. They didn't know what would happen next, but they knew something had to change. In 1955, after international pressure and public sympathy for the prisoners, Batista decided to release Castro and his followers. He thought freeing them would make him look generous, but it turned out to be a big mistake. As soon as Fidel was released, he returned to Havana. Crowds gathered to hear him speak. He was thinner, older, and more serious, but his voice was stronger than ever. He promised that the fight for freedom was not over. The next time, he said, they would not fail. But Batista's secret police were watching him closely. Cuba was no longer safe for revolutionaries. So Fidel made another brave decision: to leave his country temporarily in order to prepare for his return. He went into exile to Mexico. In Mexico, Fidel began to rebuild his movement. He met old friends and new allies who believed in his cause. And it was there, in a small apartment, that he met an Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara, a man whose name would soon become legendary. Che was a traveler, a thinker, and a revolutionary at heart. He had seen poverty and injustice across Latin America and wanted to dedicate his life to ending it. When he met Fidel and heard his plans for Cuba, he immediately joined the movement. Together, they began to organize and train a new group of fighters. They called themselves the 26th of July Movement, named after the date of the failed Moncada attack. To them, that date was not a defeat. It was a symbol of courage and determination. In hidden camps and quiet corners of Mexico, the rebels trained secretly. They learned how to use weapons, how to move through jungles, and how to survive in the mountains. They were few, just over 80 men, but they shared one dream: to return to Cuba and free their people from tyranny. At night, they sat together and talked about the future. Che Guevara spoke about equality. Fidel spoke about freedom. and everyone knew that one day they would have to risk everything to turn those dreams into reality. The odds were against them. They were young, poor, and unknown. But revolutions, as history has often shown, do not begin with armies. They begin with belief. By late 1956, the plan was ready. The group managed to get an old, small boat named Granma, barely large enough for 20 people, but they would fit more than 80. Their goal was to sail from Mexico to Cuba, land secretly, and begin a guerrilla war in the mountains. It was a dangerous mission. The sea was rough, the journey was long, and Batista's army was powerful. But Fidel believed it was now or never. He told his men, "We will be free or we will die trying." With those words, they prepared for the voyage that would change the destiny of their island. Back in Cuba, the people didn't know when or how the next uprising would come, but they could feel it in the air. Something was shifting. Posters of Batista were still everywhere, but fewer people saluted them. Even among the soldiers, some began to doubt the regime. Students protested in secret. Farmers whispered of rebellion. And in the countryside, people said the mountains might one day hide heroes again. They didn't know that across the sea, a small group of men were preparing to return, with courage as their weapon and hope as their shield. The failed Moncada attack had not stopped the revolution. In fact, it had started it. Fidel Castro's prison years turned him from a rebel into a symbol. His speech had inspired thousands, and his exile in Mexico had turned him into a leader ready to fight again. This time with stronger allies, clearer goals, and a plan that would echo across history. In the next chapter, that small boat called Granma will set sail toward Cuba, carrying 82 men and a dream far bigger than the ocean they would cross. That dream of freedom, equality, and national pride was about to reach the shores of Cuba once more.
When Fidel Castro arrived in Mexico in 1955, he was not a hero in the world's eyes, at least not yet. He was a young man in exile, far from home, separated from his people, and hunted by Batista's agents. But inside him burned a dream so strong that no prison or ocean could extinguish it. He believed that Cuba's destiny had not yet been written, and he intended to write it himself. Mexico, in the mid-1950s, was a place where many revolutionaries from Latin America gathered. It was full of students, writers, and soldiers who dreamed of freedom for their countries. There, Fidel found both safety and opportunity. He reunited with his brother Raúl, and soon they began meeting with other exiled Cubans. They needed to rebuild the movement from scratch, with no money, no weapons, and no army. But they had something far more powerful: faith. Fidel was patient and persuasive. Every night he spoke about the injustices back home, the poverty, the corruption, the police brutality, and his vision of a new Cuba, free and fair. Slowly, others joined. One of them was a young Argentine doctor who would soon change the course of history, Ernesto Che Guevara. When Fidel met Che in July 1955, it was as if two flames merged into one. Che was intelligent, calm, and deeply committed to helping the poor. He had traveled across South America on a motorcycle, seen hunger, disease, and exploitation with his own eyes, and vowed to dedicate his life to justice. Fidel and Che spent long nights talking about revolution, politics, and life. They shared meals, laughter, and dreams of what a free Cuba might look like. By the end of those talks, Che decided to join the Cuban struggle, not just as a doctor, but as a soldier. Che later wrote that he was drawn not just by the idea of Cuba, but by Fidel himself, his confidence, his courage, and his unshakable belief that victory was possible. And so, in a small apartment in Mexico City, the 26th of July movement, named after the failed Moncada attack, was reborn. The group began to prepare in secret. They rented a small farmhouse outside the city where they trained to fight. Their weapons were old and scarce, a few rifles, pistols, and homemade grenades. They practiced marching, shooting, and jungle survival. Sometimes neighbors would hear strange noises and wonder what was going on, but the men always said they were hunting. They trained at dawn and at dusk. During the day, they worked odd jobs to earn money, driving taxis, fixing engines, washing dishes, and at night they studied maps of Cuba, planning their route back home. Fidel taught them discipline and patience. He told them, "We are not fighting to destroy, but to rebuild. Remember that we are soldiers of justice, not of hate." Every man in that group carried a small photograph of their families, and every night before sleeping, they looked at it and whispered, "For you and for Cuba." By late 1956, the plan was ready. Fidel's men had found an old, worn-out yacht named Granma. It was built for only 20 passengers, but they planned to fit 82. Their journey would be long and dangerous, from the coast of Mexico to the shores of Cuba, across nearly 1,500 kilometers of open sea. On November 25, 1956, just before sunrise, the Granma left the Mexican port of Tuxpan. It was a small, white boat, rocking gently on the waves as it carried the hopes of a nation. The men were crowded together, seasick and soaked. The boat leaked, the engine broke down several times, and food was scarce. Waves crashed against the hull, and storms made them lose direction. For 7 endless days, they drifted through rough seas, sick and exhausted. Che Guevara, though a doctor, was as sick as the rest. But no one gave up. They sang songs, prayed, and told stories to keep their spirits alive. Fidel, even when hungry and tired, walked among them, encouraging everyone with his calm, steady voice. Finally, on December 2, 1956, they spotted land, the swampy coast of Las Coloradas in southeastern Cuba. The men were overjoyed. After days of struggle, they had made it. But their arrival was far from heroic. They had expected friendly villagers and supplies, but instead found deep mud, mosquitoes, and enemy soldiers nearby. As soon as they landed, the Cuban army discovered them. The government had been warned of their return. Planes and troops rushed to the area, and chaos broke out again, just like at Moncada, but this time in the jungle. Many of the 82 rebels were killed or captured within hours. Only about 20 men survived the ambush. It was a disaster, but not the end. The survivors, tired, hungry, and bleeding, began to move inland. They walked for days through thick jungle and steep hills, guided only by instinct and willpower. Finally, they reached a place that would become legendary, the Sierra Maestra Mountains. The Sierra Maestra was a wild green world of misty peaks, deep valleys, and hidden trails. It was difficult to reach and even harder to control, the perfect place for a guerrilla war. There, surrounded by trees and silence, the revolution would be reborn. The men built shelters from palm leaves, collected rainwater, and hunted for food. Villagers from nearby communities began to visit them, bringing bread, bananas, and coffee. They listened to the rebels' stories and realized that these young men were not criminals, they were fighting for them. From those few survivors, the new rebel army began to grow. They were small, but their spirit was unbreakable. They moved through the mountains like shadows, appearing, striking, and disappearing again. They knew the jungle better than the soldiers sent to hunt them. They learned to live off the land, to trust one another, and to fight not for glory, but for survival. Che Guevara became the group's doctor and later a commander. Raul Castro led another small unit, and Fidel, calm, determined, and always thinking ahead, became their heart and mind. They called themselves simply Los Barbudos, the bearded ones. Their long beards and rough clothes became symbols of resistance. What made the guerrillas different from other rebels was how they treated people. They respected the poor farmers. They shared their food. They paid for what they took. If any soldier mistreated a villager, he was punished. Fidel knew that to win the war, they had to win the people first. He said, "The people are the real army. Without them, we are nothing." Soon, villagers became their greatest allies, hiding them, feeding them, and spreading their message across the island. In the cities, students and workers began to hear about the mysterious men in the mountains. They spoke of hope, courage, and change. For the first time in years, Cuba began to believe again. At first, Batista laughed at the small band of rebels. He called them bandits and terrorists. He told the press they were only a few dozen men who would soon die in the jungle. But months passed, and the guerrillas did not die. In fact, they grew stronger. They began attacking army posts, stealing weapons, and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. Batista's soldiers, many of them poor and unmotivated, were afraid. They didn't want to fight people who were clearly supported by the villagers. Some soldiers even began to switch sides. By late 1957, the government realized that this was no longer a small rebellion. It was a growing revolution. To spread their message further, the rebels built a secret radio station deep in the Sierra Maestra. They called it Radio Rebelde, meaning rebel radio. It broadcast messages of hope, updates about battles, and speeches from Fidel himself. Every night, Cubans across the island tuned in secretly, turning the volume low so neighbors wouldn't hear. They listened to the crackling voice that spoke from the mountains. "Cuba will be free. The revolution lives." Those words gave people courage. Even in Havana, students painted 26J on walls and streets, showing silent support for the rebels. In the mountains, Che Guevara changed too. He was no longer just a doctor. He became a skilled commander, known for his bravery, discipline, and fairness. He taught new recruits how to fight and survive, and he treated the wounded, both friend and enemy, with care. Che wrote in his diary that life in the mountains was hard but meaningful. Every day was a fight against hunger, rain, and fear, but every victory, no matter how small, felt like a step toward justice. The rebels began to believe that victory was possible. What had started as 82 men on a small boat had now grown into a movement of thousands. By 1958, Batista's control began to crumble. The rebels expanded their attacks beyond the mountains, ambushing trains, taking over towns, and cutting communication lines. The world's newspapers started reporting on the Cuban guerrillas, describing them as brave freedom fighters battling a corrupt dictator. Foreign journalists hiked into the mountains to interview Fidel. They found him calm, polite, and completely confident that he would win. One American reporter wrote, "The men in the mountains may be poor, but they carry the future of Cuba on their shoulders." Through every hardship, hunger, sickness, loss, Fidel's men never lost faith. At night around campfires, they sang old Cuban songs and told stories about home. They promised that one day they would return to their families, not as fugitives, but as heroes. Fidel often reminded them, "We are few now, but we are not alone. Every poor man in Cuba walks with us in spirit." And in the valleys below, that spirit was indeed growing. The journey from Mexico to the mountains of Cuba had been long and painful. The men had faced storms, bullets, and death, yet they survived. The Granma expedition, once a near disaster, had given birth to a movement that could no longer be silenced. From the swamps of Las Coloradas to the peaks of the Sierra Maestra, the revolution had found its heartbeat. And that heartbeat was growing louder every day. Soon, the echo of that heartbeat would reach Havana and shake the very foundation of Batista's rule. The spark of rebellion had now become a flame, and that flame was about to set the island of Cuba ablaze with revolution. The Sierra Maestra Mountains, a vast, green wall rising from Cuba's southeastern coast, became the cradle of the revolution. In these mist-covered peaks, the young rebels who had once been scattered, hungry, and almost destroyed now began to grow into an army. It was here that the fate of Cuba slowly began to change. Life in the mountains was not easy. The rebels lived in rough shelters made of palm leaves and mud. At night, the jungle was full of strange sounds, insects buzzing, birds calling, and sometimes the distant footsteps of soldiers searching for them. They slept on the ground, covered themselves with old blankets, and woke up to the chill of morning fog. Food was always scarce. Sometimes they ate only wild fruits or rice mixed with water. But even in those harsh conditions, their spirits stayed strong. They were no longer just a group of young men. They were becoming brothers. They shared everything: food, stories, and even pain. When someone was sick, the others took turns caring for him. When someone died, they buried him gently in the soil of the mountain, whispering a promise to continue the fight. The villagers who lived near the mountains slowly became part of the revolution. They were poor farmers, men and women who grew corn, raised pigs, and worked the land. They had suffered under Batista's rule for years, losing land and dignity. Now, when they saw the rebels, they saw hope. The rebels helped them whenever they could. They taught children to read, helped harvest crops, and even treated the sick. Che Guevara, being a doctor, often walked for miles through muddy trails to reach a sick farmer. He carried a small medical bag, his weapon of healing in a time of war. Fidel knew that this bond with the people was more powerful than any weapon. He told his men again and again, "We are not fighting for power, we are fighting for the people. And when the people fight beside you, no army can defeat you." At first, the rebels avoided large fights. They knew they couldn't face Batista's army head-on. The army had tanks, planes, and thousands of soldiers, so they fought a different kind of war, a guerrilla war. Guerrilla means little war, but it is not about size, it is about strategy. The rebels moved like shadows, striking quickly and disappearing before the enemy could react. They would ambush army patrols, take their weapons, and vanish into the forest. They cut telephone lines, destroyed bridges, and blocked roads. Each small victory made the government look weaker and gave the people more hope. When newspapers tried to say the rebels were finished, they would strike again, reminding everyone that the revolution was still alive. Fidel insisted on discipline. He didn't allow stealing, drinking, or harming civilians. If a rebel broke those rules, he was punished or even expelled. This strict discipline earned the rebels respect from the villagers. One farmer once said, "Before, the soldiers came and took our chickens. Now the bearded men come and they pay us for them. Maybe these are the honest ones." That trust was priceless. Villagers became messengers, guides, and suppliers. When Batista soldiers came looking for rebels, they pretended to know nothing. But as soon as the soldiers left, they carried food and information to the mountain camps. In February 1958, the rebels built a small radio station deep in the Sierra Maestra. They called it Radio Rebelde, which means rebel radio. It was powered by a small generator and had an antenna made from wire scraps. Every night, the people of Cuba could hear a crackling signal on their radios. The voice was firm and calm. It was Fidel's. "This is Radio Rebelde, transmitting from the free territory of Cuba." He spoke about freedom, equality, and justice. He told stories of battles won and soldiers who had joined their cause. For many Cubans, hearing that voice brought tears of hope. In their dark, uncertain nights, it was a reminder that they were not alone. Even in Havana, students secretly listened to the broadcasts, sharing the news in whispers the next morning. By this time, Che Guevara had become one of the most respected men in the rebel army. He still treated the sick, but he also led men into battle. He was brave, disciplined, and cared deeply for the fighters under his command. His camp became known as the place where rules were strict but fair. Che kept a diary, writing about every moment, the hunger, the rain, the laughter, and the fear. He believed that the revolution was not only about fighting, but also about changing the hearts of people. He once wrote, "The true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love." And that love, for the poor, for the land, and for justice, gave the movement its moral strength. As the revolution grew, women also joined the fight. Some became nurses, teachers, and messengers. Others carried weapons and fought beside the men. They risked their lives to bring food, hide wounded soldiers, or deliver secret letters. One brave woman, Celia Sanchez, became one of Fidel's closest allies. She organized supplies, planned routes, and made sure the rebels always had food and medicine. Without women like her, the revolution might not have survived. The mountains became a symbol not only of war, but of unity, where men and women, rich and poor, stood together for one dream. Batista could not ignore the rebels anymore. His pride was wounded, and his fear was growing. He ordered massive military operations to crush the revolution once and for all. Planes bombed the mountains, dropping explosives on villages suspected of helping the rebels. Soldiers burned houses and arrested farmers. But instead of destroying the revolution, these actions only made more people hate Batista. When homes burned, new rebels rose. When villages were attacked, more young men ran to the mountains to fight. The rebels were no longer just a handful of fighters. They had become a movement of the people. By mid-1958, the rebel army was stronger than ever. They now had hundreds of fighters, better weapons, and the loyalty of entire communities. The people trusted them more than they trusted the government. Fidel divided his forces into several columns, smaller groups that could cover more ground. He sent Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, another brave commander, to march westward towards the center of Cuba. Their mission was clear: move out of the mountains, spread the revolution, and capture new territories. It was a bold plan and extremely dangerous, but they succeeded. Along the way, towns surrendered without a fight. The people welcomed them with food, flowers, and cheers. Farmers offered their homes, and soldiers deserted Batista's army to join the rebels. In Havana, Batista tried to show confidence. He gave speeches claiming everything was under control. But behind the scenes, he was nervous. Foreign journalists were writing about his corruption and cruelty. Even the United States, once his strongest supporter, began to distance itself. American newspapers published photos of the rebels helping villagers, teaching children, and distributing land. For the first time, the world saw that these bandits were actually fighting for justice. One U.S. reporter wrote after meeting Fidel in the mountains, "He is young, intelligent, and has the support of his people. He may not have many men, but he has something Batista never will: hope." As 1958 went on, the revolution became unstoppable. In cities, students protested and organized strikes. In the countryside, villagers refused to cooperate with the government. And in the mountains, the bearded rebels advanced closer to victory. Everywhere you looked, the symbol 26 de Julio, July 26th, appeared on walls, flags, and banners. It was no longer just the name of a failed attack, it had become the name of Cuba's future. One of the most famous moments of the guerrilla war was the Battle of El Uvero. It took place in May 1957 when the rebels attacked an army outpost near the coast. It was a fierce fight, bullets flying, smoke rising, and men shouting through the jungle. But for the first time, the rebels fought a full military engagement and won. The victory was small compared to the government's power, but it was symbolic. It proved that the revolution was no longer just about hiding and surviving. It could fight and win. After the battle, Fidel walked among the wounded, comforting them and making sure the dead were buried with honor. That day, the rebels felt something they had not felt before: confidence. Even in the middle of war, Fidel insisted on humanity. If government soldiers surrendered, the rebels treated them well. They gave them food, medical care, and often sent them home safely. This kindness confused the enemy. Some soldiers even began to surrender willingly, saying, "We would rather be captured by the rebels than serve Batista." War had made the rebels strong, but compassion made them respected. In the Sierra, the rebels also built small schools. They taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to children and adults who had never been to school. Fidel often visited these schools, sitting with the children and talking about the future. He told them, "A true revolution is not only about guns, it is about education. A nation that knows how to read can never be enslaved." Even during battles, the rebels dreamed of the Cuba that one day would rise. A Cuba of schools instead of prisons, books instead of bombs. The years in the Sierra Maestra were full of hardship, hunger, and loss, but also courage, unity, and hope. From a handful of survivors, the revolution had grown into a movement that could not be stopped. Fidel, Che, Raúl, Camilo, and their followers had turned mountains into classrooms, radios into voices of freedom, and ordinary people into heroes. The jungle had trained them, not just to fight, but to lead. And as 1958 drew to a close, their dream was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, echoing from the mountains to the cities. The time was coming when they would leave the Sierra and march to Havana, to end the old world and begin a new one. By the end of 1958, the Cuban Revolution had grown from a small spark in the mountains into a powerful fire sweeping across the island. What began with 82 men on a tiny boat had turned into thousands of fighters, supported by the hearts and hopes of an entire nation. The world was watching, Batista was panicking, and Cuba stood on the edge of change. In the cities, the atmosphere was tense but electric. Students held secret meetings, workers whispered about strikes, and the people, tired of corruption, poverty, and fear, began to stand tall again. For years, Batista's soldiers had ruled through terror. They arrested without reason, tortured without mercy, and killed without justice. But now, when the army entered a village, people no longer bowed their heads. They looked them in the eyes. The old fear was dying, and as fear faded, courage took its place. From the Sierra Maestra, the rebels began their final march. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Camilo Cienfuegos led columns of fighters across the island, east to west, capturing towns along the way. Everywhere they went, people welcomed them with cheers, food, and flowers. Farmers offered their horses, Mothers hugged the young soldiers as if they were their own sons. Even some of Batista's soldiers laid down their weapons and joined the revolution. The countryside, once silent, was now alive with the footsteps of change. Che Guevara's group marched through central Cuba, moving carefully and quietly through forests and towns. It was a long and dangerous journey, hundreds of kilometers on foot, carrying weapons and supplies on their backs. But Che's discipline kept the men focused. They fought several battles, including one of the most important, the Battle of Santa Clara. Santa Clara was a key city. Whoever controlled it controlled the road to Havana. Batista's troops guarded it with tanks, armored trains, and hundreds of soldiers, but the rebels had something stronger: strategy and the support of the people. In late December 1958, Che and his men surrounded the city. They blocked roads, cut communication lines, and attacked enemy positions from all sides. Then came the famous moment that turned the tide of the war. Che's men derailed an armored train filled with weapons and soldiers. Using just a bulldozer and hand tools, they tore up the railway tracks. When the train approached, it crashed and fell off the line. The rebels captured hundreds of soldiers and seized all the weapons on board. It was a stunning victory, the symbol of a people defeating an army. When news of the victory spread, the country erupted in celebration. In every home, people whispered, "The end is near. Batista is finished." Meanwhile, Camilo Cienfuegos, known for his bright smile and cowboy hat, led another rebel column through the plains. He was beloved by everyone, brave in battle, kind to villagers, and always laughing even in danger. His men adored him. Together, Camilo's forces captured key towns like Yaguajay, defeating Batista's army again and again. Every victory weakened his dictator's control and strengthened the people's belief that freedom was coming. The rebel army was no longer hiding in the mountains, it was marching proudly through Cuba. As the victories multiplied, Fidel Castro coordinated everything from his mountain headquarters. He gave careful instructions to his commanders: no looting, no revenge, and no cruelty. He wanted the revolution to be moral as well as military. He said to his men, "Our strength is not in our guns, it is in our principles. We are not destroyers, we are builders of a new Cuba." His words reminded everyone why they were fighting, not for power, but for justice. In Havana, Fulgencio Batista could feel the walls closing in. He no longer trusted his own generals. Corruption had spread through every corner of his government. Even his closest allies were secretly meeting with the rebels, planning for a future without him. Foreign journalists reported that Batista's army was collapsing. Many soldiers refused to fight. Officers fled the country, and ordinary Cubans took to the streets, chanting for change. On New Year's Eve, December 31, 1958, as fireworks lit the sky over Havana, Batista made his final decision. He fled. At 2:00 a.m. on January 1, 1959, Batista boarded a plane with his family, friends, and millions of dollars in cash. His plane took off into the night, leaving Cuba behind forever. When the people of Havana woke up that morning, they couldn't believe the news. The dictator was gone. The police had vanished. The streets were filled with joy and disbelief. Strangers hugged each other. Church bells rang. Children waved flags in the air. It felt like a dream. After years of suffering, Cuba was finally free. But the country also stood at a crossroads. Batista was gone, but no new government was yet in power. There was chaos, confusion, and hope, all mixed together. That same morning, Fidel Castro's voice came through Radio Rebelde, calm and steady. "The tyranny has been overthrown. The revolution has won, but our work has just begun." Fidel and his men began their long march to Havana. They traveled through towns where people waited for hours just to see them pass. Crowds lined the roads, cheering, crying, and throwing flowers. Old men removed their hats. Women wept with joy. Children ran beside the columns of bearded fighters. They were not seen as conquerors, but as liberators. Everywhere they went, people brought them food, water, and songs. Some even walked for miles behind the trucks and jeeps, wanting to be part of history. It was not just a military victory. It was a celebration of hope. On January 8, 1959, Fidel Castro finally entered Havana. He rode in a jeep, dressed in his olive green uniform, waving to the crowds. Tears streamed down the faces of thousands who had gathered to welcome him. For many, this was the happiest day of their lives. They believed that at last, justice had returned to Cuba. Fidel stood on a balcony and gave a speech that lasted for hours. He thanked the people, honored the martyrs, and promised a new beginning. He said, "This time, the revolution will not be betrayed. This time, it will belong to the people." The crowd roared with cheers, flags waved, and the Cuban national anthem echoed through the streets of Havana. The revolution had triumphed. In the days that followed, Fidel and his team began to organize the new government. They promised land reform, schools for all children, and fair treatment for workers. For the first time, poor farmers were told that they would own the land they worked on. The 26th of July movement, once a group of rebels, now became the new leaders of Cuba. Fidel Castro became the prime minister. Che Guevara helped lead economic reforms. Raúl Castro took charge of the armed forces, and Camilo Cienfuegos was hailed as a hero of the people. Cuba was filled with pride and excitement. It felt like a new dawn, full of promise and purpose. For a brief moment, the island was united. The rich and poor, young and old, all celebrated together. People painted slogans on walls, "Viva la Revolution!" "Long live the revolution!" Posters of Fidel and Che hung everywhere. In schools, children sang songs about freedom. In villages, people danced all night. Everyone believed a brighter future had arrived. It was a time of dreams, and the biggest dream was equality. But freedom always comes with sacrifice. Just months after the revolution's victory, tragedy struck. In October 1959, Camilo Cienfuegos, one of the most beloved commanders, disappeared while flying over the ocean. His small plane never reached its destination. The news broke hearts across Cuba. People cried in the streets. Even Fidel wept publicly for his lost friend. Camilo had been more than a soldier. He was a symbol of courage, kindness, and joy. His disappearance reminded everyone that revolutions, even when victorious, carry pain. Despite the sorrow, the work continued. The new government began programs to teach reading and writing in every village. New schools were built, and doctors were sent to rural areas for the first time. Land was taken from wealthy landlords and given to poor farmers. For the first time, many Cubans felt seen and respected. They felt that the revolution truly belonged to them. But in the background, new challenges were already forming. Not everyone agreed with Fidel's ideas. Some feared he was moving too quickly and that Cuba's new direction might cause conflict beyond its borders. Those tensions would soon lead to one of the most traumatic confrontations in modern history. From the shadows of the Sierra Maestra to the shining streets of Havana, the Cuban Revolution had completed its journey. A dictator had fallen, and a new nation had been born. The people danced, sang, and dreamed of a future filled with fairness, education, and pride. But revolutions, like tides, do not stop once they begin. They move forward, sometimes in calm waves, sometimes in storms. Cuba had won its freedom. Now, it had to decide what kind of freedom it wanted. And as the cheers of victory echoed through the island, a new challenge loomed on the horizon. The challenge of leading a country in a world divided by the Cold War.
When the sun rose over Havana in early 1959, a new Cuba was born. The air was filled with music, joy, and pride. After years of suffering under dictatorship, people finally believed that justice had arrived. The revolution had triumphed, and its leader, Fidel Castro, was now the most admired man in the country. But revolutions are not just about victory. They are about what comes next. And what came next for Cuba would change not only the island, but the entire world. In those first months after Batista fled, Cuba was full of hope. Everywhere, people cleaned their streets, raised new flags, and painted slogans of freedom on walls. Children sang songs about liberty. Teachers volunteered to go into rural villages to teach reading and writing. Doctors packed their bags and traveled to the poorest towns to treat people who had never seen a doctor before. The rebels, now heroes, returned from the mountains to cheering crowds. The people gave them flowers, food, and hugs. They called them Los Barbudos, the bearded ones. For most Cubans, they were no longer rebels. They were saviors. But amid the celebrations, the new leaders knew that their hardest work was just beginning. Cuba was poor. Its cities were crowded, its farms were broken, and much of its industry was owned by foreign companies, especially those from the United States. For decades, American corporations had controlled Cuba's sugar, tobacco, and telephone businesses. Even the country's electricity company belonged to the U.S. Fidel and his team wanted to change that. They promised to make Cuba independent, not just politically, but economically. That meant the people of Cuba would own their land, their factories, and their future. But such a change would not come easily. It would anger powerful interests, both inside and outside the island. One of the new government's first big actions was land reform. Fidel signed a law giving large estates to poor farmers. No longer would a few rich landowners own thousands of acres, while peasants worked for pennies. Now, families could farm their own land and keep what they produced. This made many Cubans rejoice, especially the poor. But wealthy Cubans and foreign investors were alarmed. They saw their lands being taken, their profits disappearing. Some left the country in protest, moving to Florida and other parts of the United States. At the same time, the Fidel government took over big industries, banks, sugar mills, and oil refineries. They called it nationalization, making these businesses belong to the people. But most of these companies were American-owned, and soon Washington began to react. For many years, the United States had seen Cuba as a friendly neighbor, a place where Americans vacationed and invested freely. But now, under Fidel Castro, Cuba was changing fast, and its leaders were talking about independence, socialism, and equality. American officials began to worry. They asked, "Is Cuba becoming communist? Will Castro turn against us?" At first, Fidel insisted that he was not a communist. He said his revolution was for justice, not ideology. But as time passed, his speeches grew sharper. He accused the United States of exploiting Cuba for decades, and he refused to be controlled by any foreign power. Soon the friendship between the two countries began to fade, replaced by suspicion. In 1960, the U.S. government decided to stop buying Cuban sugar, one of the island's biggest exports.
It also banned the sale of American oil and machinery to Cuba. This was meant to pressure Fidel into changing his policies. But instead of giving in, he turned elsewhere for help, to a new and powerful friend, the Soviet Union. The Soviets, who were rivals of the U.S. during the Cold War, welcomed Cuba with open arms. They offered oil, money, and weapons in exchange for sugar and political alliance. For them, Cuba was a perfect partner, a socialist island just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. The Cold War, a global struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, had now reached the Caribbean. By 1961, Fidel Castro made it official. He declared that Cuba was now a socialist country, following the ideas of communism. He aligned himself openly with the Soviet Union and its leader, Nikita Khrushchev. In his speeches, Fidel said, "Our revolution is of the humble, by the humble, and for the humble." He promised that Cuba would never return to a system where the rich controlled the poor. The government took over all private businesses, and the state began to plan the economy. Education and healthcare became free for everyone. Books replaced advertisements. Hospitals replaced casinos. Many Cubans celebrated these changes, proud that their country stood strong against the world's most powerful nations. But others felt afraid. Some lost their homes or businesses. Some disagreed with the government's new rules and fled the island by boat. The revolution had united Cuba, but it was now beginning to divide it too. The United States, alarmed by Cuba's growing friendship with the Soviet Union, decided to act. In April 1961, a group of Cuban exiles trained by the U.S. government attempted to invade Cuba. Their goal was to overthrow Fidel Castro. They landed at a place called Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. But the invasion failed. Cuban forces, led by Fidel himself, quickly defeated the attackers. Within 3 days, it was over. The failure embarrassed the U.S. and strengthened Fidel's power. He appeared on television waving the captured weapons, declaring, "This was the victory of the people. Cuba will never surrender." From that day, the world saw Cuba not as a small island, but as a proud nation standing up to giants. But the tension didn't end there. In 1962, something even more dangerous happened. The Soviet Union began secretly placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, weapons capable of reaching the United States in minutes. When American spy planes discovered them, the world held its breath. For 13 days, humanity stood on the brink of nuclear war. American ships surrounded Cuba, blocking any Soviet deliveries. President JFK demanded that the missiles be removed. Fidel prepared for invasion. And the whole world feared that one wrong move could start World War III. Finally, a deal was reached. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles, and in return the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba again. The crisis ended, but it left scars. From that moment, Cuba became deeply tied to the Soviet Union and distanced from its old neighbor to the north. After the crisis, Fidel Castro continued to reshape Cuba. The government launched literacy campaigns that taught nearly every adult to read and write. New schools, clinics, and hospitals appeared across the island. Cuba became known for having some of the best doctors and teachers in Latin America. The island's culture also flourished. Music, dance, and art reflected the pride of a people who had stood up against the world's powers. But daily life was not always easy. Because of the U.S. economic embargo, Cuba struggled to get goods like food, cars, and fuel. Many products disappeared from stores. People had to wait in long lines for basic items. Still, most Cubans remained proud of what they had achieved: independence. They had fewer things, but they had something they valued more: national dignity. Around the globe, Cuba became a symbol of defiance. Many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America saw Fidel as a hero, a man who had stood up to empire and proven that even small nations could fight for their freedom. Cuban doctors and teachers were sent abroad to help other developing countries. Cuban troops even joined struggles for independence in Africa, fighting against colonialism. But others saw Cuba differently. To the U.S. and many Western nations, Fidel was a dangerous dictator who restricted freedom of speech and controlled every part of life. The island became both admired and feared, a beacon for some, a threat for others. Cuba's revolution had started as a local struggle, but now it was part of global history. Over the decades, Fidel Castro became one of the most famous and controversial leaders in the world. His speeches could last for hours, his voice echoing across plazas filled with thousands. He wore the same green uniform, smoked cigars, and lived modestly compared to other leaders. He survived hundreds of assassination attempts and stayed in power for nearly 50 years. To his supporters, he was a hero, the man who gave Cuba education, healthcare, and pride. To his critics, he was a dictator, a man who silenced opposition and ruled with an iron hand. But no matter what people believed, one thing was certain: Fidel Castro had changed Cuba forever. Today, when people talk about the Cuban Revolution, they speak not only of war and politics, but of transformation. It turned a small island into a symbol of resistance and self-reliance. The revolution taught the world that freedom can mean many things. For some, it is independence from foreign control. For others, it is the right to speak and choose freely. Cuba's story is one of courage and consequence, of a dream that lifted a nation, but also divided it. The Cuban Revolution was not just about one man or one battle. It was about an entire people deciding to change their destiny. It showed that ordinary citizens, farmers, teachers, students could stand up against armies and empires. But it also showed how power, once won, can become heavy to carry. Revolutions are like fire. They bring light, but they can also burn. Cuba emerged stronger, prouder, and more educated, yet isolated, watched by the world with both admiration and caution. Today, decades later, the echo of that revolution still lingers in the wind that moves through Havana's old streets. The songs of freedom still play, the murals of Che and Fidel still stand, and the people, with all their struggles and pride, still tell stories of how their island rose from oppression to independence. The Cuban Revolution reminds us that history is not written only by the powerful, but by those who dared to dream, to fight, and to hope. And as the waves crash against Cuba's shores, one truth remains: freedom is never given. It is fought for, shaped, and kept alive by those who believe in it.